Welcome. Well, you're at home with Jim and Joy, and you are an important part of our EWTN family. And we're delighted that you have welcomed us into your home, and what a privilege it is. Well, we would love to hear from you, so send us an email with a question or a comment to jimandjoy@ewtn.com. Well, today we will have the second part of our show with Matthew Bunson. He's the EWTN senior contributor, senior editor to the National Catholic Register, and is the author of yet again another fabulous book, St. Pope Paul VI.
And you know,
he's telling us everything we never knew about him.
And Matthew Bunson's just a nice guy.
He's a great guy.
We like Matthew.
Well, Pope Paul VI is canonized this Sunday, October 14th, and EWTN and only EWTN is going to give you the most live coverage that you want to see and hear. It will be absolutely beautiful.
And how we need saints.
Yes.
How we need godly examples of people who go all the way for the Lord, may fall down periodically, but get back up and keep on going with great courage. And Archbishop Oscar Romero, Blessed Oscar Romero, will also be canonized along with several other saints to be. And Oscar Romero is just an amazing story of courage and dedication and throwing his lot in totally with the sheep of El Salvador as the Archbishop of San Salvador. I believe he was assassinated in 1980 as he celebrated Mass. And he was assassinated for his radical identification with the poor and with the weak, and beginning to call the government out on their repressive actions. And for this, he was put on a death squad hit list and was killed. I wanted to quote a quote or two from Oscar Romero. He said, I believe the day before his assassination, "No one has to obey an immoral law. It's high time you obeyed your consciences rather than the sinful orders. The Church cannot remain silent before such an abomination. In the name of God, in the name of this suffering people whose cry rises to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression." Speaking to the government. I believe it was the next day he was assassinated. He also said, if God accepts the sacrifice of my life, may my death be for the freedom of my people. I do not believe in death without resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador. This is why we need saints.
Yes.
I mean, this man celebrated the Mass. He knew what he was doing. He imitated what he believed, even unto death, and he was a believer in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. So Matthew's going to be sharing with us about the canonization. He's going to be there. EWTN will be covering it, and so don't miss the rest of this show. We'll be right back. Please don't go away.
Welcome back. Well, we have Matthew Bunson back with us today to talk more about his book, Pope Paul VI, and also just about all that he knows and understands about him. You want to hear it. Don't forget, Blessed Pope Paul will be canonized this Sunday, and EWTN will bring you the Canonization Mass live from Rome, beginning at 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, Matthew Bunson, I'm going to reintroduce him to you all again. He is the EWTN senior contributor. He's the senior editor of National Catholic Register. He is the author of St. Pope Paul VI. What he was and what he is, he was a great son to his parents. He was a beloved brother to his brother. And now he gets to be an outstanding husband to his beautiful wife, Bonnie. Isn't that fun?
That's an impressive sounding resume, actually.
Senior.
Yeah, that gets to be worrisome too, doesn't it?
Well, Matthew, last time when we were sharing on Wednesday, you kind of left off at the point of Paul's, well, he was Montini.
Right, Cardinal Montini.
Participation in the Second Vatican Council. John the 23rd dies. He's John the 23rd's right-hand man. He decides to go forward with the Second Vatican Council. Speak to us about the outcomes of the Second Vatican Council, perceived, real, and what this meant for the Pope, Paul VI, moving forward.
There was an absolutely dumbfounding contradiction, it seemed, that at the end of the council in 1965, there was this sense of optimism, of joy, that something special had happened, is how some of the cardinals described it and some of the bishops who took part, including Karol Wojtyła, of course, who went on to become Pope John Paul II. And then something seemed to have gone horribly wrong. And that's an important distinction to make, because there has been this tendency over the years to blame everything on the council, as though the documents themselves were responsible.
Right.
When you actually read the documents, that Pope Paul VI had such a significant hand in shaping as Pope, you begin to appreciate their teachings.
Yes.
And we had two future popes who were significant players there, in Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, and of course Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, both of them firm adherents, firm admirers, and they loved the work of the council and saw it as essential. So this sense of optimism then was replaced by a kind of gloom that settled over. Why? Because there seemed to be so much chaos in the years after the council. Well, what else was happening in the world at the time? Well, we had the sexual revolution, we had massive political upheavals, we had the Vietnam War, then we had Watergate in the US, we had the ongoing struggle with the Soviet Union. But the killer was the one that I just mentioned, the cultural and sexual revolutions that hit like a storm in culture, that began slowly chipping away and then trying to wipe away the church's moral teachings and her moral authority. This was the environment that Paul was facing as Pope, as he took on the task of trying to implement this council with the work of all the world's bishops. It was an immense task, and at times, I think they were overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, talk about, he always seemed from earliest times to sense the burden, to feel the burden. Maybe this is why there was credibility too. If I become a cardinal, I might become a pope. I don't know if I want to bear the burden of all that. How many priests, how many sisters were lost after Vatican II? Again, not as a result of the teaching of Vatican II, that was there, but the anticipation of a particular application in the midst of what was going on in society at that time. What was his response? How did he feel? I'm sure he had more conservative voices, then he had all this fallen out, all the criticism, sensitive guy. How did he deal with this?
With immense prayer, with immense fortitude, but also I think with great sorrow. He spoke often in his writings and in his speeches of the great tragedy of so many priests leaving the church in the wake of the council. That in those years after, they, in his view, kind of abandoned the church to pursue other things. This for him was absolutely heartbreaking. But he was looking at as well at the false interpretations of the council that were beginning to creep into so many different corners of the church. We think of the infamous Dutch catechism, for example, that was proliferating in certainly the Netherlands and elsewhere, that was in direct contradiction of the teachings of the church. And he had to then take steps to try to suppress the catechism at a time when the authority of Paul, the authority of the bishops, was being directly challenged by theologians. And so Paul tried to navigate a very difficult series of rivers, of whitewater rafting, so to speak, of trying to hold together the faithful in this time of immense confusion, upholding the teachings of the church, and then also trying to positively restate what the council was trying to accomplish. It's why you see when you read through his different speeches and his writings, he's always trying to defend the work of the council and begging people essentially to read what the council actually said and what the council was trying to achieve, not what other people were trying to say about the council. This reached its climax under John Paul II in his pontificate, because and then under Pope Benedict too, you had what they describe as the emergence of hermeneutics. I don't want to get into philosophy, but a lens for how you see things. And there were two ways of looking at the council. Was it in continuity with all the teachings of the church, this hermeneutic of continuity and reform of all the other ecumenical councils, or was this a hermeneutic of rupture, that everything that had gone before is no longer important, that we can just ignore it or we can wipe it away.
Yes.
Paul was firmly convinced in continuity, and he said that on a number of occasions, and you can see that in his own writings. At a time, though, when it was very difficult, even for the Pope, to be heard.
Yeah. You mentioned on Wednesday, I was trying to articulate what Vatican II, may have been called for. Can you say again what John the 23rd said the calling of that council was for? Because I think this relates to what happened afterward and wrong expectations.
That's
what
right.
did he say?
John the 23rd had a very simple task for the council. Hard to implement, but a very simple task. He said, we want to be able to communicate the unchanging truth and beauty of the church to the modern world, but in a way that the modern world can understand and can take to its heart and to its mind.
Well, and that would be the new breath. Right now, just breathe this and believe this to be true. But the powers and principalities, I mean, I can't imagine the demonic spiritual warfare that he had to endure and stand, and just stay steady. How did he do that?
You make reference, in fact, to one of the most famous addresses of his pontificate, and you can't really talk about Paul and the Second Vatican Council in the years that followed without thinking of it. 1972 on June 29th, so this is the anniversary, actually, when he was installed as Pope. He gave a presentation, a speech, in which he said, and very famously, that it seems at times that the smoke of Satan has entered through a fissure into the church. Now, interestingly enough, that has never been officially translated. You have to do sort of a summary of it, because that's the only thing that we have today. But he talks about what we were just discussing. He said it seemed as though at the end of the council there was this time of optimism that was replaced by gloom, by pessimism. And now, he said, it seems as though the smoke of Satan has entered into the church. People mistrust the church. They mistrust us. And they, as he put it, and tell me if this sounds familiar today, they chase after any Messiah, anyone who promises them the secrets of life. He said, what is the answer? He said, the answer is as it has always been, Jesus Christ and his church, to be faithful to the church. That, in a way, is the great legacy of Paul VI. At a time when everyone was forgetting who Christ actually is, he reminds us who Christ is
and how
why
we need to be
him.
reminded today.
Yes.
I mean, the only thing I would take, I don't know, maybe it's too critical, take issue is, it seems like the smoke, I would say it looks like, I think the smoke is in the temple. That's not overly pessimistic, but it's just looking at what's happened there. But we should have a sense that this can be overcome by the power of conversion, the name of Christ, the power of Christ, the power of we know the victory in that, but we can't deny what's going on within the church herself.
And we go back to what Paul himself said, embrace Christ, to love Christ, and to love the church. And you see this golden thread through all of his writings of the human person in the modern world. And one of his great fears was that the church would either become isolated. He actually used the phrase that the church must not become closed in on herself, something that Pope Francis has talked about. Or he said that we open up so far to the world that we lose who we are, which is one of the great risks that we're seeing today. So we're seeing that the struggle within the pontificate of Paul VI is the one that has been playing out in the decades ever since. But we can then see how his successors, even John Paul I, who followed him immediately, was there for only 33 days as Pope, but we can look at him, we can look at John Paul II, we can look at Benedict XVI, now we can look at Pope Francis, that there is this treasure of writings from Paul VI that we can really use to understand our predicament today, because he had such a prophetic voice. Humani Vitae is one of them, Populorum Progressio, and other writings.
Let's go with Humani Vitae. We can't not speak about that. Because it seems to have a relationship with Vatican II. From your book, I understand that this is John the 23rd as well, right? Because he wanted to address this issue of this chemical and spacing of conception and birth. And so he wanted to do that. Wasn't that supposed to be in Vatican II, and they decided for a commission?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so it wasn't addressed at Vatican II. There was this commission that developed, and then Paul VI inherits that as well, right?
He does.
Tell us
so
about,
again, it's much like the council. He inherits this commission. It gets larger and larger. To appreciate, though, what was actually
the lesson of
happening-
this: whoever you're following, you ask how long you're going to live.
And did it get as large as 70 people?
It did, yes.
Okay.
And it became this controversy just in itself. And when you look back on it and you read the majority report, you can begin to appreciate that in many ways the deck was stacked against.
What was the purpose of the commission?
The purpose of the commission was really to explore the impact of contraception. Okay. Now, you have to appreciate that fully. You have to go all the way back to the 1930s, when contraception itself was first being embraced by the other community, the other ecclesial communities, the other churches, the Episcopalians and others, which is what prompted Pope Pius XI to issue his famous encyclical, his document, Casti Connubii, which reaffirmed the teachings of the Church on this matter, on contraception.
Is that Christian marriage?
Yes, exactly. So we have this continuity of teachings.
Right.
So, but then the question was, okay, we have all these scientific breakthroughs in contraception, otherwise known as the pill, 1960. Right. So is this actually potentially illicit? We need to explore this. So that the point of this whole commission was to ask that question, but then also to look at a time when the United Nations was already beginning to say things like, well, maybe we can use the pill to control population growth and to begin to reshape societies. What are the implications of that? That's why this original commission had sociologists and economists and mathematicians and a host of other scientists and doctors, but it just kept growing and growing. And it's very clear, as I was saying, that from the start of it, there were members of this commission who wanted it to have a certain ending.
It had a different agenda.
It had a very different agenda, and the result was what became known as a majority report. Now here's where this courage of Paul VI comes out, because he receives this report that was only supposed to go to him. It had no weight, official weight in the church. It was just supposed to be a report from a commission. There were elements and forces in the church and outside of the church who wanted this report to be released, so it was. Contrary to all decency, so that they were trying to pressure, to push Paul into accepting contraception for the church. He thought about it, he reflected on it, and the result was Humanae Vitae, in which he forcefully, clearly reiterated the teachings of the church.
And it wasn't at the Lambeth Conference where they said, even if they blessed the pill, but they said that it should be done with restriction. I mean, the cat is out of the bag. How are you going to put restrictions on it?
They knew exactly what was going to happen when they did it, but they did it anyway. And you can trace the Lambeth Conference, the embrace of contraception, especially by the Protestant churches, to the decline of morals in the 20th century and now beyond.
So he had to take the position again, Paul VI, that he took with the Second Vatican Council, that John the 23rd took. I mean, these are churchmen, and they're saying, we're going in, there are unchangeable things, but we need to get into these times and how best we can articulate this. And if there's certain questions, there's new disciplines that have developed and have grown, we need to look at that. But there's some things that just aren't going to change in terms of our doctrines and our morals. And it was the same thing with Humanae Vitae and contraception. This has already been decided. This is the natural law. This Casti Connubii. This has been condemned. It's a new form of contraception. What are the implications of this? Let's look at this. But there was never any intention to change.
No, and that's made very clear in Humanae Vitae. And so since then, there's been this argument about, well, what's the magisterial weight of Humanae Vitae? They're always trying to chip away at this idea of the authority of the Pope, but also what is very clear an objective morality for how we lead our lives. But there was also that other concern that you find in Paul's pontificate that is another one of those important keys, one of those pillars of his pontificate, and that is, this goes back to the council, the interaction, the place of the human person in the modern world. What is that place? What is the human dignity?
And the value and worth of that person.
That's right. So you look at Humanae Vitae, that would have eradicated one whole element of the human person. Then you look at another document called Populorum Progressio and other things, which is on human progress. So Paul, building on the Catholic social teachings going all the way back, of course, to Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum, looks at the person in the modern world and the immense threats to the person. Paul had a deep concern about secularism and about atheism. Because he lived through communism, he lived through Nazism, much like John Paul II. But he was looking at this new world, this brave new world that was advocating abortion and atheism. And he saw where that was going to lead. And it was a profound realization on his part that the human person was under direct threat. So just as we can see Humanae Vitae creating this beautiful fertile ground for the theology of the body under John Paul II, we can also see Paul's teachings on the human person in this setting, setting the table also for John Paul's great concern for the human person that we see in Evangelium Vitae and Veritatis Splendor, and his very first encyclical as Pope Redemptor Hominis.
Yes. Thank you. Matthew Bunson is here with us. We're going to take a break at this point. We're going to hold him over. Plenty more to come. What a great Pope. What a great saint for the Church. Going to be sainted this weekend with Oscar Romero. Matthew Bunson's going to be right there. EWTN's going to be covering it all this weekend. We'll be right back. Please don't go away. We continue our conversation with Matthew Bunson about his new book, St. Pope Paul VI, and you're also going to the Canonization.
Indeed.
This weekend. You share a lot in your book about Paul VI's holiness and spirituality. Please say a few words about that and then take us to your thoughts about the canonization.
Paul VI is going to be canonized. I mean, that's a statement of fact now, and it's a source of joy for all of us. It's helpful to remember that we're not canonizing Paul VI because he was Pope. He's been canonized because he was holy, because he was a saint. He perfected the virtues to a heroic degree that the Church has found him to be worthy of being inscribed in the canon. I say all of that because there's always this tendency to think that just because you're Pope, that somehow you're going to be a saint. The history of the Church would dispute that. Right. But he's also one of the numerous modern popes who are saints. Think of John Paul II. We even have a cause now open for John Paul I. This is important because Paul, I think, understood the significance of holiness in the modern world and how the universal call to holiness that the Second Vatican Council celebrated, building on, of course, the great teachings of the Church throughout the centuries, including Francis de Sales, who said that everyone should be a saint. Paul VI, then, in his own life, tried to pursue the virtues to a heroic degree. He had a profound spirituality, and his own confessor, Paolo Dezza, who was eventually a cardinal, made the joke that if Paul wasn't a saint at the time of his election as Pope, he certainly was by the time it was over. Think of the burdens that he carried, but he did so very prayerfully, he did so in humility, and he did it with love for the Church. Those are all things that you want to have as a saint, but he also was deeply imbued with the spiritual life. And he actually authored a document on joy. Yeah, okay. So, Pope Francis talks about the joy of the gospel. Well, Paul did it before he did. And why not? Because joy is the heart of the Christian life if you're living in the world. Right. Our love for Christ makes us joy-filled. And Paul, who was this very introverted figure who seemed very somber, he was filled with joy. He just didn't, it was not his way of expressing it. Yeah. So you had joy, you had the virtues, you had prudence, you had fortitude, all of these things entering into his life. And then he had this profound prayer life that we can begin to appreciate in his writings. And in this book, I hope, helps people to understand just how much he loved the Church, how much he loved Christ, and how much he wanted to share Christ with the world.
Matthew, share a brief word, we're running out of time, just about the canonization. Oscar Romero?
Yes. Well, a martyr, an archbishop, somebody who, much like Paul, was misunderstood, whose time, he was not a supporter of liberation theology, as some have claimed, who was faithful to the Church and died on behalf of his people, on behalf of his flock, in 1980, gunned down while saying Mass. And he was a contemporary of Paul VI, and as such, the two of them, I think, it is fitting that they be canonized in the same day. I'd prefer Paul to have his own day, but that they both lived through and died during this time of immense upheaval in the Church and the world, and are models for us.
Matthew, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for being a great representative of the Church. We thank God for your life. St. Pope Paul VI, the canonization is coming up this weekend. Plenty more to come on EWTN. Hope you've enjoyed the show today. God bless you and all of your loved ones. Bye now.